Hi, you are listening to Record of Change. This episode is a bonus episode, and here's why. On April 26, the International Alumni Center in Berlin, which is a think and do tank for alumni communities with social impact, invited us to be guests on their virtual couch. Monday on the Couch is a regular event run by the IAC for public discussion and exchange among socially engaged people. As guests of this event, we, the team of Record of Change, reflected on COVID stories that we so far had captured with our podcast. What gives us hope? Which coping strategies did we learn about? The event was moderated by Carina Rother, a German journalist based in Taiwan. If that sounds familiar to you, yes, we already featured Carina in season 3 of our podcast. So this time, we swapped our seats and Carina interviewed us. Let's listen back to this conversation.
I have a special relationship to the podcast Record of Change because I was interviewed by it as a freelance journalist living in Taipei, originally from Germany. And I'm super happy to be on the other side of the creators today, and I'm happy to be the one asking the questions. And our speakers for today are Huy Tran, who is a PhD researcher in migration studies at the University of Duisburg-Essen. He's based in Germany right now. He's originally from Vietnam. And he has worked in the field of media before and done field research in Japan, among other places. And our other speaker today, and sort of the godfather of Record of Change, or sort of whose brainchild it partially was in the beginning, is Matthias Jochmann, who's based in Bonn, Germany, and who is from Germany. And he is bringing his expertise as a cultural manager and as a radio producer to the podcast, and also his connections that he's gathered in the years of working in Latin America, Europe, Asia. So we have their two perspectives and their two experiences with creating the podcast today. Let me briefly say a few words about the podcast before we start. It is best conceptualized, I think, as a global attempt to archive and to document the changes brought on by this global pandemic to individuals and to communities all around the world. And it is created by people from all around the world. And since April 2020, the podcast has gathered sort of 30-minute episodes. They've followed 15 individuals with their experience of COVID and sort of the changing circumstances at different points in time. And we're going to highlight particular stories that the creators have encountered over the process of those almost 12, or by now 12 months of making the podcast. Before we dive into those stories, I would like to ask you, the creators and the speakers, a few questions about it. And let me start with you, Huy. Maybe you can give us a bit of a behind the scenes feel of what it's like to be working in this very sort of transnational team on this very transnational topic. Like, how does the collaboration work? And how do you exchange your sort of what you're gathering in the process of making the podcast?
Thank you, Carina, for a very important questions, because that linked me back to how Matthias, as one of the founders of the podcast, contacted me in 2020. So when Matthias first contacted me, I was still in Japan at that time doing my field research for my personal research. And then he told me that we are going to be a very international team, and we have members located in different locations in the world. And one of the first challenge, if we come together as a team, is how are we going to coordinate our weekly meetings? Because when we started a new project, there were so many things to discuss about. And maybe sometimes things didn't work very well if it is just communication via emails. So we need to come up with weekly meetings. And one of the first challenges that we meet is that because we live in different time zones, So it was a bit challenging at first. So it was a night meeting for me when it was a morning meeting for Thomas, an afternoon meeting for Matthias and Pratap at first. It was quite interesting because, well, you have different ideas in different times of the days, and then in the combinations, all the team members work out quite well with their brainstorming. And personally, I think working in these very transnational projects have a personal meanings for me because my research also have to do with transnationality. It is quite funny that most of us have never met in person. So I think Matthias is the only person in the team that have met some other people. But for example, I have never met anybody else in the team in person apart from Matthias. But somehow, the more we work together in this podcast project, the more we get closer.
So what we're seeing today is also the context in which Record of Change is created. It's a very similar setting. Matthias, I would like to turn to you and sort of understand a bit when you came up with the idea, what you set out to do, and also how has that maybe changed and morphed over the time of creating Record of Change? And what has changed in the record in a sense?
Yeah, so the idea came up in a just private discussion with Kim and me. Yeah, when was it? Maybe last year, April. Back then I was based in Palestine. She's based in Hamburg in Germany, and we're wondering about this idea of we are all in this together, because it's maybe a very unprecedented situation that everyone in the world is facing the same threat, which is a virus. And we planned for initially, I think, 20 episodes, which would have been 20 weeks, so less than half a year. And back then, when we were conceptualizing the podcast, we're like, yeah, okay, 20 weeks, by then we are done, right? We all know better now. And what has changed? I mean, of course, the perspective changed because we learned this is not going to be over sometime soon. And maybe the more important one was to learn we are dealing with the same threat, but we are dealing with it in a very, very different perspective, no matter where we go to, who do we talk to. Obviously, now we see this run for vaccination in the global north countries, leaving many global south countries behind. We see many environments that we listen to facing many other threats. I mean, we talked to a person from the Gaza Strip in Palestine. They live under very different circumstances than we do I do in Germany, as I do live very differently to a person in Cameroon or in Cape Town or in Hong Kong. So what I'm saying is that, yes, we are in this together, but we learned very much that we live with it so differently.
I want to jump in there and ask about the person living in the Gaza Strip. You're talking about Fida Shurab, who is a contact of yours, and you've talked to her 3 times already over the period of the pandemic. And she works with handicapped children and sort of as a community activist. And I found interesting about her story that in the beginning she said sort of the special position of being in Palestine is that it's actually working out in its advantage because it's so isolated that the virus can't get in. But that changes relatively quickly. So maybe you can, before we listen to her, explain a bit who she is, what she does, and what her situation is in Gaza.
Yes. So I have never met her in person. The idea to feature her came because I was working in Ramallah, in the West Bank, and I found it, I mean, the Gaza Strip in itself is a huge topic, but thinking of the pandemic, it's a double threat. So thinking of the term lockdown, they are under a lockdown for many years already because they're close by a wall, they cannot move freely. And so this is what I was trying to say when I mentioned in talk with her that maybe for the first time ever, this wall, this separation has been a blessing in disguise, that it was so difficult for the virus to come in. Unfortunately, it got in, and it really is still a very, very difficult situation there. So Fida is working for the so-called Al-Faluna Society for Deaf Children. So they primarily work with children with and without handicaps, and provide community work in terms of basic education. Now when the pandemic hit, they provided on-site education and facilitation through WhatsApp and Zoom and just sending letters, like physical letters, to how do you deal with this pandemic, how do you deal with being confined at home with your family, how to prevent domestic violence. So this is what she shared in the very beginning. And she, as mentioned, she did share how the virus had it more difficult to come in. Now, I think in the second episode she said, yeah, everyone will get infected. In the third episode she said, yeah, I just went through it myself. And she shares a lot on how difficult it is in terms of the health system in Gaza. It's kind of non-existent. When we spoke the first time, I read many stories of how the General Hospital of Gaza City was dealing with electricity shortages, having only 4 to 6 hours of electricity per day. And then we not yet even talk about PPE and mask and sanitation care.
I think that's also something that becomes very clear when we listen to her, sort of what the specific difficulty is that Gaza is faced with in this situation. And you have prepared a clip that I'm going to play now of Fida at the point where she has already been infected and where she talks about sort of how the virus is affecting people in Gaza. Okay?
People do not get the test because at personal level, I've been infected in January, actually, me and my family. So, okay, maybe our condition at home is better than many families in Gaza, but it's very stressing to stay for a long period of days at home. And I can imagine those who have difficult home circumstances and those who have livelihood hardships, how it would be for them to be at home, isolated, not being able to go out even to earn their income. So no, he won't go to the test because he will be isolated, he and his family. So he would live with it. And I know many people who are doing the same. They don't get the test. It's clear that it's corona, but they're not going to the test because they would be facing so many difficulties.
So we basically hear her talk about how it's very unregulated. You don't even know who has COVID, or there is no medical oversight. What have you found in her story? Is that a story of suffering or of resilience? I mean, she has quite a cheeky way of talking about her own infection and how her whole family got infected. And then they chose not to tell her father because he's an elderly man and they didn't want to freak him out. So I found that quite interesting of a way of dealing with that crisis.
Yes, I agree. It's super interesting that. So in the last episode we talked, I think in March, like 6-7 weeks ago, and she said, yeah, I just been infected myself. I was the first one to find out. Then I stayed in my room for a week and then found out that the rest of my family got infected too. And the dad has already been old and with previous diseases, so they decided not to tell him because he would, as you mentioned, he would freak out. And even after all the family passed it, she was laughing about it. No, it's better that he doesn't know. I think the way she's fascinating me in a way that she's always laughing in a situation where, I mean, of course, I have never been to the Gaza Strip. I cannot really tell how life is there. And of course, people deal with it in their individual ways. Just what I found very interesting from the very beginning, that she's just, yeah, we have hope. It will be better. We will manage. And this was, I think, even the title for our first episode, like, this is not the last crisis. This is just one of many challenges that we face in the Gaza Strip. But we are optimistic people, and we hope for the best and we plan for the best. So she was always, I mean, we record interviews using Zoom, so I could see her face, and she was always smiling. And even in our first interview, when we had many electricity shortages, which kind of gave me a feeling of how resources are cut there. Yeah, she was just laughing about it, saying, yeah, this is here, this is our life here, but that's fine, we will manage.
And we sort of chose to compare her story to the story of a couple in Hong Kong who were also infected by the virus, and whose story went sort of very differently because they got to stay in hospital or were isolated for the entire period of time. And obviously it's also interesting because they were in immediate proximity to China, to the source of the virus. And that's Wendy and Dominik, and they were interviewed by Ke-Cheng Fang, who's also part of the producer team. And maybe, Anh-Huy, you can tell us a little bit more about their setting, why you chose to interview them, what happened to them in the course of the pandemic before we listen to them.
Yeah, sure. We decided as a team to talk to Wendy and Dominik relatively soon because when we started out the project, it was relatively, well, I think the pandemic is still in the relatively early phase. And then Wendy and Dominik stood out as individuals or like as stories because they were one of the first participants in our podcast that tested positives for the virus. And their stories also stood out very much because they were planning to migrate and settle down in Canada before being tested positive with the virus. And because of such a result for the test, that they had to suspend their plan to migrate to Canada and then have to stay in Hong Kong for a while. And then as you have just also introduced, that they have to stay in intensive care for a while and then they recover from that. But their story also have a lot of interesting aspects why they are in intensive care. We can see the interactions between people who tested positive for the virus and then the people who are care workers and the people who are working in the hospital at that time. So by the time that we talked to them for the first time, the pandemic has not expanded as now. So the way in which people treat the people who have the virus were very different than now. So by that time, we got to listen how their first-hand experience in the intensive care unit go. And it was a very interesting way for us to know, so what does it feel like to have the virus? And what does it feel like to be treated for it? And they also experienced changes in jobs as they prolonged their stay in Hong Kong. So I think Wendy changed her jobs from insurance agents into a social worker after her experience with the virus. So I think their stories shed various interesting insights into how individual lives can be, or not even like in the daily life, but also trajectories can be affected by the virus.
Yeah, and it's also what I found striking is Wendy, she is from China originally, and we're gonna hear her talk now with what she's experienced.
I was so scared to never see my parents again because my parents are still living in mainland China, and due to the travel ban, they are not able to come to Hong Kong, even I get infected. So at that time, I was so scared that I will die in Hong Kong, and I was not able to see them before I died.
So when you were feeling much fearful and even thinking of death, did you think of blaming anyone for this?
We decided to immigrate to Canada because of the recent situation in Hong Kong. We will lose our freedom, we will lose our rights. That's why we decided to immigrate. And that's why we get infected in the way of immigration. So I think it is the Chinese government I blame most.
So that's quite a frank statement from Wendy there. In the beginning, she says she's worried that she's never going to see her parents again. I'm not sure if she has. Maybe that's a question to you two. If she has seen her parents in the meantime and if her situation has gotten better.
Yes, they met again. So this first interview was recorded last year in August, and now for the Chinese New Year she went home. So beginning of February she has been home. Of course, taking into account the regulations now between Hong Kong and mainland China, we can usually move quite freely. especially if you have a mainland Chinese passport. I think she had to spend a total of 4 weeks in quarantine then, 2 weeks there, 2 weeks there. But yeah, they went back. I would like to add one sentence on this, because we also, this statement, we found it quite frank, and I spent some time in China and I was very surprised to hear someone blaming the party. And we also had discussions on this and also found it interesting. Why does a person from mainland China say this? Especially in the context now of the national security law in Hong Kong, which was also partly featured in the podcast with Wendy and Dominik.
Yeah, I find it interesting as well. And I can imagine that sort of Wendy and Dominik's experience of the early phases of the virus were quite different from the rest of the world. I'm in the area as well. I'm in Taiwan, so not far away. Huy, you were in Japan at the time, so it must have felt much more immediate for you and for them, right? When the pandemic was when the news were coming out of China. Did they say anything in regard to that? Or is there a different trajectory maybe to how the pandemic unfolded in Hong Kong as compared to the other countries that you've talked to, people who got infected?
I think you are right. When the pandemic broke out, I was in Japan. You felt that, like, at least geographically, it is more proximate with the source. But interestingly, at least in Japan, when I was in there, very few people actually mentions that, they are blaming it on any parties. They know that it's happening. They know that when the news reached Japan, and then I remember the first time that it was a big deal in Japan was the story of a cruise ship. And then they know that there were people who tested positive on that cruise ship, and then the cruise ship stayed in a port in Yokohama in Japan for several weeks. And then the big discussion then was that, like, how do the Japanese government deal with such cruise ships with, like, full of positive passengers? And then that was the big news by then in Japan. But if I remember it correctly, nobody actually directly blamed any parties for the pandemic or the happening of it. And where I'm from in Vietnam, the stories is very, very different, because with the political environment, the tension between Vietnam and China in the past few years, people tend to like to blame a lot. So I would not be surprised if other people in Vietnam who would share the same concerns as Wendy.
It's funny that you bring up Vietnam, because that's where the next interviewee that we're going to look at comes from. And so with Fida and with Wendy, we had people who sort of were most immediately affected by the pandemic. And the case in Vietnam is quite the opposite. And Huy, you interviewed Truong Dat Nguyen there. And he is sort of the prime example for how amazingly Vietnam has dealt with the pandemic, because the only thing that's been affected for him is his job, and that's just because of his profession. So maybe you can share with us who he is and what his circumstances are.
Right, so that is a pilot in Vietnam. He's based in Ho Chi Minh City. And the reasons why we want to talk to him was that basically by the end of the year, I talked to him in November 2020, and by that time it was pretty clear that, well, the pandemic is not going to end soon. And we have very, very negative stories all around the world. And Vietnam was one of the few places that have been controlling the pandemic in a very good way. So if you look at Vietnam at that time, the number of cases were super, super low. And there was only one time of, 1 month lockdown by the beginning of 2020. And then everything went back to normal. People went to concerts, people went out on the street without masks, and social gatherings were allowed. So we decided to talk to people who are in Vietnam to have a different perspectives on social contexts that are so different from what the rest of the world have been experiencing. So we decided to talk to that because not only the fact that he was living in Vietnam, but also because of his professional. Because as we know, the aviation industry with the travel restriction all around the world is one of the most heavily heated industries during the pandemic. And then I wanted to talk to him to understand how, in a social context like in Vietnam, how the aviation industry has shifted and how they have been operating. And he is an aviation captain for a while as well. And as you said, Carina, the only main aspect of his life that has been affected by the pandemic is his job, but in a way that like normally he would fly both internationally and domestically. But now the international side of his jobs got cut off and he just fly domestically. But the workload is still the same because in Vietnam, domestic travel was still allowed. So they increased the flights in domestic flights. But so basically it's just like very, let's say, not so much of his life has been negatively affected by the pandemic. And that is the other side of the story that we also want to show in our podcast.
Yeah, and we're going to listen to him now and sort of see how he takes that change to his work. And I think it's quite a surprising attitude.
For us as airlines pilot in an Asian country, we have always been very optimistic about our career because it forecasts for the next 40 years, Asia will be always short of pilots. And 2020 hits, and the first time in many pilots' life that it hits them like, oh, I actually can lose my job, and it's not always go up. So somehow they are highly paid employees and valuable to most of the countries. So the thing is, people can be nervous, but they should think of this as just a holdback, because once the pandemic gets under control, everything will be back to normal and even develop much faster rate than before. And especially in aviation, I think maybe not in 2021, but eventually you will see a bounce back with aviation.
So in a sense, COVID only exists for that in a professional way or in a sort of slight holdback, and he's very optimistic about the prospects. I want to ask the two of you, do you think that's a privilege? And is it maybe a privilege of public governance if a country manages to control the pandemic well and then allows their citizens to experience it in that way? Or is it luck? How do you make sense of this sort of striking experience of not being affected by COVID?
Before Matthias jump in, I just wanted to quickly add that I think such an attitude or perspective from that is really much dependent on the social context where he is living in. So I assume 100% that he would not have such a perspective if he is living elsewhere, not in Vietnam but elsewhere, just because he is living in a context that as I said, every social gathering was still allowed to some certain extent. Travel was still allowed, or like it was still possible for people to move around the country. And the government even have like some kind of campaign to boost domestic travel and to save the travel industry in the country. And that is why he was still having one side of the domestic side of his job, and that's why he was so still, let's say, optimistic, and then have such a bright side to look at the pandemic. But it would change drastically if, let's say, you live in a place where pilots have no jobs to do. One, and tied it very much to the question that you asked, I do think that it somehow shed many lights on the different shades of privilege that we are trying to represent throughout the narratives that we shows in our podcast. So many people think that like when we talk about privilege, before this corona crisis, we had very different ideas of like, okay, so people from these certain areas in these certain countries are normally associated with being privileged. But this crisis basically turned things upside down. It turned things in a very unprecedented way. I really like the fact that we talked once, Carina, about how privilege should be perceived in this time. And then you struck me with one sentence is that when people before this talk about pandemic, people usually just thought about it happening in areas like Asia or Africa. And then now there are countries like Vietnam or Taiwan in Asia that handle the pandemic in a very different way in other, perceivedly privileged country in the West. So basically, we have like different ideas of how privilege works now, and it ties very much to how the government controls the pandemic. But also, I think there is a much deeper layers to this when it comes to governmental control, because in order to have such kind of control, let's say in Vietnam, people have to comply in different degrees. And whether people in different contexts are happy to comply with such control or not is a different story.
Matthias, do you want to jump right in?
Maybe just one thought on that in particular. I don't want to really talk about how different countries are dealing with it. More what really struck me about his interview was how much he's confident about aviation industry being just growing more and more after the pandemic. While for me personally, I did have periods in my life where I took, now looking back, way too many flights. And for me personally, I really learned from this pandemic, I don't need to take much flights. I will so much more reconsider, do I need to take this flight? Do I need to sit close to people? And do I need to contribute to climate change by taking a flight or not? So maybe my hope was more that after the pandemic, aviation industry would be a bit weaker. People would take less flights. So yes, for me it was more the surprising part about this interview. Like he's just saying, yeah, we have a holdback, maybe 1-2 years, but then we just grow more and more again.
It's very interesting what you're saying, because I think that might actually have to do with how much a country is going through change because of the pandemic. I mean, here in Taiwan, I see it as well, that because there is no actual threat of life being turned upside down, so it's very much like you can go at business as usual and you don't actually have to really question what brought the pandemic about, what are our ways of living that we need to change if we want to make sort of our global interconnectedness more sustainable. There is another story that we sort of chose of someone who is not as hard hit by the pandemic as you would sort of expect based on his location and his profession. Your co-creator Stephanie, she talked to Aaron Levine, who's based in London, and he works as a comedian, so as an artist, but then at the same time he says that he has been sort of okay throughout the pandemic. Matthias, maybe you can give us sort of an overview of why you talked to Aaron, what his situation is, and what he's going to share with us in the next clip that we're going to listen to.
Okay, now I will try not to spoil too much of the clip, but maybe in a general background, how we choose our interviewees is we always try to diversify in location, in the gender, in the profession, and in the socioeconomic background, which might be a criticism here that, of course, we do speak to relatively more privileged people because we need like 2 devices. We need a smartphone, we need a computer, we need a stable internet connection, we need a good English proficiency, and this already excludes many people. But still, we try to diversify, and then we were thinking of, we would love to have someone more from Europe, and why not London? Because at the time of first interview, I think London was a time of being very, very strongly hit. We're talking about this British variation of the virus, when shortly after European mainland stopped flights and so on to the UK. And I mean, also in terms of diversifying, we don't only want to hear the sad stories or the tough stories. We hear them all day long in our own lives. We wanted to hear positive perspective probably, or a funny perspective. So that's why we chose Aaron as a comedian based in London. And then, yes, he has a very privileged background that he shares in the clip.
We also chose Aaron's because of the occupation as well, because we thought about, okay, so when every performing activities are not allowed, so how do people who are artists, who are performers, deal with such situations? And as a stand-up comedian, he was one of the people whose working situation is not ideal in this time.
And also, I think his situation sort of raises the question, is there humor after COVID, or sort of how do we laugh about the pandemic? Can we laugh about the pandemic? But that's not what he talks about now. We'll sort of hear what he tells us.
I'm really looking forward to the vaccine being out and getting back on the road and connecting with people. And I'm really lucky. I did inherit money, and I've got enough in the bank where I don't need to make a living. I'd be so screwed if I had to make a living. But there's a lot of comedians out there who they actually made a living from it. You know, I made maybe £400 a month, which is not a living, but people who are doing better than me, or sort of semi-professional, who made a living. A lot of my friends, and they just lost their living like that. They've relied on charity and the government.
So he's in the very fortunate position of being financially independent, but he also talks about some of the strategies that artists or comedians in particular have found in the UK of performing despite not being allowed to fill a room, be on the stage. Maybe you can introduce those a little bit.
Yeah, both Aaron and also our other interviewee, Mike from Cape Town, South Africa, they share a lot on how people in the live arts, how they are struggling in the beginning and how they are trying to find ways to reach an audience, which by theaters, they try to do it with filming the play and then streaming it for free or not for free. For comedians doing the same, which both of them would hardly work, so they really miss the live experience. So that's a lot what he's sharing, Aaron, that it's kind of impossible to replace the live experience of a stand-up comedian in the interaction with the audience.
So we'll move on to our final set of two people that you have chosen sort of because of their resilience or because of their particularly difficult circumstances that they at the same time make almost light of in the interview. And I'll start with you, Matthias, because you talked to Blanca Rivera, who is a teacher, and she's based in Quito in Ecuador. And from her experience, I hear that the COVID situation is quite dire in Ecuador, and at the same time, she is a very cheerful person. So who is she and what can we expect to hear from her?
Yes, Blanca is originally from Guayaquil. That's where I met her like 14, 15 years ago. And last year, I read these stories on the news of especially the city, Guayaquil in the south of Ecuador, that so many people died within a very short amount of time that people started to bury the passed away relatives in their courtyard, in the front yard, or just storing them on the street because there was literally no space. So this was the reason for, I need to reconnect to Blanca. I want to hear her perspective on that. Her perspective is a very different one. She says, yes, it's been terrible and all the cities smelled like trash and we're all used now to have people passing away in our families. Yet she stresses the highlight of this is an opportunity. This pandemic is an opportunity for us to learn for a better future. And she highlights also the challenges for Ecuador, which has a very, very sensitive ecosystem. You may know it from the Galapagos Islands, where they very much feel the impact of the climate change. So she very much stresses the fact of, hey, we should use the learnings from this pandemic to challenge or to face the threat by the climate change.
And she also shares how, on a personal level, people manage to deal with the pandemic, and that's what we're going to hear her now talk about.
I don't want to romanticize the unemployment in Ecuador because this is like a state responsibility, but people in general, they actually are eating somehow. And right now, well, in our community, we can actually start cultivating our own food. And I think this is what it's about. This is the opportunity that I believe it's working. Like my dad, he has worked in agriculture for many years, like 30, 40 years. Right now, he's so excited to help people. So he goes and brings food, and he has lots of people that are helping him. Of course, they take food or, like plantain, that it's what our property produces the most. That before they actually got waste because it's just so much work that nobody did anything. But now he's so happy to, okay, this is going to help somebody to eat. And I think this is the opportunity that as a society we're seeing.
I just love that sentence from her saying people are still eating. So she basically talks about how people make the best of the situation by themselves. And I want to ask you, is that how does that make you feel when you hear her talk about these horrible deaths and people not even being able to bury their loved ones? And at the same time, she talks about the pandemic as almost an opportunity for her community, and also as something, she says that the church is the only institution that's helping them because she has no faith left in government and in the health ministry. So how did that make you feel?
I think if I would have just read the story, I would feel super sad. But I was talking to her, and I do remember the moment. It was late at night in Germany because of the time difference. And we were laughing. We were laughing all the time because that's her perspective and that's her energy of having a big smile in her face. Maybe a bit, there are similarities and there are big differences to Fida and Gaza, that both you would, from an outside perspective, think, oh, what a horrible situation. But both being very positive about it. And with Blanca, it just gave me this feeling of, she really wants to make it just better. She's a teacher. She was talking a lot about this bond that she, especially now in pandemic with homeschooling and distant teaching, that she built up with her students, because she has this belief that we can learn, we can be stronger as a society, we can grow our solidarity, we can be more aware of the climate change. So maybe I got more hope from that, and hope and very positive energies from talking to her.
Yeah, from her, I also think what Blanca has just shared just remind me of what Fida has just shared about the intersections between personal livelihood and community responsibility. So Fida said no one in the Gaza want to go test it because it might affect their personal life or the way in which they earn the money. And then Blanca also said that, everyone's have to eat. So it really boiled down to the fact that people always have to find solutions in circumstance like this. And then their story shows that people are super resilient and they are always being active in finding coping mechanisms. They are not people who just sit tight and then wait for what would happen the next day. Okay, so they always have to think of, okay, so the situation is like this, and then how should I deal with it in the best ways? And that is what I admire about these people who are constantly thinking of what should we do in this situation? And then it's not just sitting tight.
Yeah, and someone else who struck us when we were preparing this by not sitting tight is the next person that we want to look into a little bit. He's called Alkaus Mikhail, and we're bringing the story back to Europe because he's based in Athens, and Pratap Nair talked to him, and he is an entrepreneur and a restaurant owner and a hotel owner. And maybe, Huy, you can tell us a bit about what problems he faced when the pandemic first hit Europe, and how he deals with it on a personal level, but also in regards to his business and what we can learn from him, maybe.
Yeah, I think we want to feature the story from Alkaus because, as you might see now in everywhere in Europe, take out and not dine in is the norm now. And then with that, we were wondering, so how do restaurants owners or business owners deal with such restrictions? And yeah, luckily our teammate Pratap had a connection to Arkis in Athens. And then by that time, he was in the period of setting up his new restaurant. And then it was a very exciting time for him trying to open a new business, as we can imagine. And then the pandemic hit. And then what we want to tease out was how such new business deal with the lockdown, deal with the restrictions, and how do entrepreneurs' resilience were teased out during this time. And Arkis basically had various strategies. He also went through a lot of emotional stages. So he went through being bored, being depressed, being hopeful, all of those emotional stages. And I am not going to spoil much, but I just want to say that he also showcased a very, very interesting menu for his vegan restaurants.
And what struck me about him as well is also how incredibly resilient he was in the end. If I remember correctly, he is talking about how he worked out throughout the pandemic, how he sort of learned new skills, how he took more time to make music, and that type of positivity and lightheartedness in face of basically existential threat, because it was his family business. They had just taken out a lot of money to redo their hotel. That I had never heard something like this before. And so now let's hear what he made out of the lemons that life threw at him, in a sense.
Basically, what I have done during the lockdown, I have changed the menu completely. So the dishes we serve right now have less ingredients. And I try to use almost same ingredients to all of the dishes. So, if one dish, isn't going, we can use the ingredients of that dish to another dish. Most of our dishes are really easy to make, so I don't need many stuff in the kitchen.
Can you give me some examples of what you're serving?
Like one of our most popular dishes, it's like a poke bowl, Hawaiian bowl. So we make like a sushi rice, and then we have the watermelon. Watermelon is like in season now, so you can find it very cheap. Like with a big watermelon, I can almost serve 40 dishes. So what we're doing with the watermelon is we bake it in the oven, so it loses all of the moisture, and then we marinate it for at least 3 days, so it gets a taste of tuna tartare.
So this is an incredibly innovative recipe that we might all want to try someday. And it's interesting because both Blanca and Alkes talk about food, and they also both talk about community. Because what Alkes is saying, that his neighborhood used to be sort of defined by tourism, and his restaurant was often occupied by tourists. And so it's almost a positive change, right? To the both of you, like how has the community changed, or what does he share about how his community has changed through the impact of the pandemic?
I think for him it was a good situation that also locals would see it as a good opportunity to eat vegan every now and then, even though it wasn't popular maybe among them before. So he did also share that many places in his area, they would have been seen only as, these are the tourist traps, so this is where we don't go to. But yeah, he managed to attract also local customers and keep it running.
Yeah, and what he shared was that normally even local would not consider going to restaurants like that because there were so many tourists, international tourists there. And then, as Matthias have just shared, local people would regard them as tourist traps and might not willing to try them out. Yeah, I think some of the people in the audience have not very enthusiastically. And I think, what we want to show here is because of the lack of tourists, we want to tease out that the community always try to neutral themselves or like members of the community. And I think through the story of Arkis, we want to show that people do care about each other. People do care about the people around them. their local business or their community.
Yeah, so we've seen Alki's stories, Blanca's stories, Aaron, Dat, Wendys and Fidas, 6 very, very different people in very different settings, different occupations, different COVID stories. And thank you so much to Matthias and Huy for bringing those people closer to us, or sharing your experience of interviewing them and giving us an insight into their world.
That's it with the bonus episode, Monday on the Couch. If you liked this episode or Record of Change in general, we would be flattered if you shared it with your networks. Also, you can follow us on your favorite podcast provider, or on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, recordofchange.com. This podcast is implemented with and by members of the Bosch Alumni Network, a community that brings together former and current fellows, grantees, and staff members of the Robert Bosch Stiftung and its partners. Thank you for listening.